So let me ask you a question as we get started this morning. Do you like rules? Are you a person who likes rules? Let's be honest. Come on, show of hands. If you're a rule follower in the room today, go ahead and raise your hand nice and high. Raise them proud, you rule followers. I see you out there. All right. Now let's see another show of hands this morning. If you just love breaking them, man, raise your hand. Come on, be honest. I see you out there, you rebels. Yep, my wife's one of them. She's got her hand up back there. You heathens. All right, here's the truth about rules as we get started this morning. I think we all love rules as long as we like the rules, right? Can I get an amen to that? Right? We love the rules that we like, right? And the fact of the matter is, we don't want to follow the rules that we don't like. I think a perfect example of this is probably the most commonly broken law on the planet is speeding, right? I don't think there's a single person in this room who has not broken that law, if you have a driver's license, who's not broken that law at some point in your life. And not only broken it, let's be honest with ourselves here, willfully broken that law, broken that rule, right? That's only 5 miles per hour over. I mean, if you're less than 10 miles per hour over the speed limit, that's actually not even speeding, right? Right? Isn't that how we think about that rule? But technically, if you want to get down to the letter of the law, anything over the speed limit is breaking that rule. You are technically over the limit, right? And yet, here's what all of us do, right? We'll be flying down the highway in a 55 at 70 miles an hour, and some other guy goes flying by us at 90, and we're like, oh man, I hope they get busted down the road, right? And then when we see him pulled over down the road, we're like, yeah, they got nailed, right? Right? So when it comes to rules, right? Bottom line, again, let's bring it back to this. We love the rules that we like. We love rules when they work in our favor, but when they don't work in our favor, well, not so much. I see this all the time, just be transparent with you today, in my parenting with my children, right? I will tell my kids, don't do that. We don't want, eat your vegetables, right? You need to make sure you're, brushing your teeth every night, right? We have all these rules for our kids that we enforce and mandate. But then it's so easy sometimes for us as adults to just literally turn around and break that same rule the next day, right? Like, yeah, eat your vegetables, but I'm like, yeah, I'm getting a quarter pounder with cheese at McDonald's. I'm not getting the salad, right? And so we do this kind of thing all the time, right? And it got me thinking this week as we get ready to dive back into our series here. We're in a series that we're calling Mark, Season 1. We're just working through verse by verse through the first couple of chapters of Mark. And it got me thinking about how many people in our world think about Christianity, this whole Jesus following thing that many of us in this room aspire to. And it got me wondering how many people have chosen not to follow Jesus because what they believe is that this whole Jesus following thing is really about following rules. It's about following the rules. If you follow the rules well, then you're in, man. You can be a part of this thing. But if you're not willing to follow the rules, well, then you're kind of on the outside looking in. Just don't even bother, right? I think that's how a lot of people think. And sadly, I think many people have kind of chosen not to be Christians, not to believe in Jesus because what they've seen is Christians who tout this whole rule-following thing. Hey, here's all the things you've got to do, and then turn around and don't actually follow them themselves. And I think every one of us, myself included, has been there. We have all been hypocritical in the things that we're supposed to do, right? Supposed to do to be a good Christian. And then the world sees that and they're like, I don't want to have anything to do with that, if that's what this whole thing is all about. But as we begin this morning, what if I told you this? For some of you in the room, even some of you maybe who you profess to be followers of Jesus, I don't know what everybody's background is in here from a Christian perspective, but what if I told you there's actually only one rule that we have to follow? Just one. I think for many people in the room, hopefully, that might lift that burden off a little bit. Now, I do want to preface this by saying this. While I believe there's only one rule, I believe that one rule is so much more difficult to actually follow. And that's why we desperately need the grace of God in our lives. And so we're going to talk about that today. What is that one rule, right? And how can we maybe move beyond, and maybe you're in the room today, you've never really heard this before. How can we move beyond this idea that, man, in order for me to be a Christian, I got to follow all the rules and I got to follow them all to the letter of the law perfectly to the T. And if I don't, I can't be a part of this thing. I want to help maybe free you from that, because here's what I believe. Jesus came to set us free from that type of thinking. He did. So last we left off in Mark chapter 2, verse 22. And Jesus is essentially, the best way that I can put it, I think the way that Mark kind of describes what Jesus is doing and kind of going through here is he's upsetting the establishment, man. Everywhere Jesus goes, he's doing things and he's saying things. And what he's doing is he's really infuriating the religious leaders. And this week, as we continue looking at Mark's gospel, he's going to do it again. And we're going to find he's going to do it again and again and again, over and over again. And what's actually beginning to happen as this story of Jesus' life and ministry is beginning to unfold is there is a rising tide of animosity coming for Jesus. I mean, there is a storm brewing that is ultimately going to end with his life on the cross and his death on the cross is where it's ultimately going to end. These religious leaders, he is going against everything that they have fought for and tried to establish in their world. And they do not like it. And so today we pick up, we're going to be in verse 23, Mark chapter 2, 23. Encourage you, bring your Bibles each week, follow along with us. I encourage you this week, at some point, go home, read this out, maybe study this out a little bit more deeply for yourselves. But we're going to hit the high notes here this morning. This is how it begins. It says, one Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields. And as his disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath? Let's just stop right there. Let's set the scene, all right? Jesus and his disciples, they're walking along, traveling, right? They're moving from town to town, ministering. Jesus is healing, right? He's teaching, and it happens to be the Sabbath. And they're walking from, we don't know, some town to another town. And as they're walking along, maybe it's lunchtime, we don't know exactly, but they're getting hungry, right? Now, in those days, roads were actually pretty scarce. What you actually had most of the time were just like little paths that would cut through various fields and forest areas in order to get from one place to the next. And so what's happening here is they're walking through a grain field, most likely wheat or barley. Wheat and barley kind of was blooming, if you will, between about April and August. So we know it's sometime in the spring or summer. And they're walking along and all of a sudden they're hungry. And so they begin to just pluck a couple of grains from the wheat or the barley. They kind of rub it together. If you've ever seen wheat or barley before, you kind of rub it together and to get the seeds, right? And you kind of throw away the chaff, if you will. And then they were popping some kernels, man. They were enjoying some lunch along the way. And so these Pharisees, they see Jesus and his disciples doing this. And they ask this question: why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath? They accuse them essentially of breaking the Sabbath laws. The Sabbath law of working, reaping, harvesting, preparing a meal on the Sabbath. Now, we're going to get to the insanity of that here in a second, but before we go there, I want to talk about the Sabbath for a second from the context of Judaism and first century culture, the first century culture that they were living in, right? The word Sabbath comes from the word Shabbat. And all it simply means is to cease or desist, to stop, to rest, right? All of those words can kind of fit into Shabbat. And so what Shabbat or Sabbath was this law that was given by God during the Mosaic covenant, right? It's one of the 10 commandments. On the seventh day, right, you're going to rest in the same way that God rested on the seventh day when he created the earth, right? God has built in this pattern of work, rest, work, rest. And on this seventh day, what God has actually done is given people a gift. This amazing gift to be able to say, we don't have to work on this day. It's okay to rest. It's okay to take some time off. I don't have to work myself to the bone. I don't have to be busy all the time. And so God gives this amazing blessing. But here's what has happened. In the 1,500 years, approximately, since Moses gave the law to the Israelites, these guys called the Pharisees have added rule after rule after rule to this Sabbath day. And what it's actually done is it's actually made the Sabbath an incredible burden, which is just irony to the nth degree, right? This day that God has set apart to be totally restful and freeing has now actually become the most burdensome, tiresome, exhausting day of the week. And this is what religiosity and legalism will do to a person. It will turn the goodness of God, the faithfulness of God, all the good things he wants for us into something so heavy and burdensome. Let me give you some examples. Some of these are insane, okay? During the Sabbath, you were not allowed to carry anything that weighed more than a dried fig. Nothing heavier than a dried fig. Not just a fig, but a dried fig. They were very, very specific, right? Because you know that extra couple of ounces, if it wasn't dry, boy, then you're over the limit, right? Think about the insanity of that, right? Because if you carried anything that was heavier than a dried fig, that was considered work. You were not allowed to do it. You were not allowed to. If you tossed something in the air, you had to catch it with the same hand. You could not catch it with the other hand. Again, think about the insanity of that. Why? Because that's work now. If you catch it with one hand in the same hand, it's not. But if you catch it with the other hand, that's work. What? Right, that's craziness. You were not allowed to. If you had furniture and your house had a dirt floor, you could not move any furniture in your dirt house because it would constitute plowing. And therefore, that was considered work. I mean, just insane laws. You could not kill an insect. Some of you ladies would be in big trouble on the Sabbath. Oh my gosh, there's a spider in here. Like, I guess we got to burn the house down now, right? They could not kill an insect. Nothing, not an ant, not a fly. I mean, there could be flies on their food. Nope, can't kill it. Let it lay eggs in there and then eat it. Right? Yeah, disgusting, exactly. Right? Craziness, absolute insanity. You could not walk, this was their rule, you could not walk more than a half mile or 1,999 steps, which they somehow figured out was a half mile. You weren't allowed to. You could not go more than 1,999 paces from your house. Otherwise, that constituted work in some way. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm generally a rule follower. I really am. As long as I like the rules. If that was the rule that was put on me, you know what I'm doing? 1, 2, right? I mean, if I want to get to my friend's house and they're 0.6 miles away instead of 0.5, I'm figuring out a way to take as big as steps as I possibly can to get to my friend's house so that I can hang out on the Sabbath, right? Insanity. And this is what I want you to see. I just want you to see the craziness of these laws, right? You couldn't look in a mirror. This is what they said. You can't look in a mirror because if you look in the mirror, you might find a gray hair. And if you pull out that gray hair, that's work. And I think we all know it is a little bit of work to pull out a gray hair, right? You can't do that. Not allowed to do that. If you were sick, and this is where we're going with this. This is where it really starts to get just messed up, man. If you were sick, unless it was life-threatening, you were not allowed to be treated. Because on that day, on the Sabbath, if somebody treated you, that was work for them. Right? Again, absolutely insane. If you had a knot that was tied, you weren't allowed to untie it. That's work. You weren't allowed to tie a knot. I mean, heaven forbid you tie a knot to tie something down on the Sabbath, right? All these laws. And I'm telling you right now, that this is just like the tip of the iceberg. There were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these that the Pharisees imposed on the people of Israel, right? And what's crazy to me is if you run into someone today who is an Orthodox Jew, they still live by this. I kid you not. Last summer, I went on vacation with my wife's family. We went to Florida. We went to Disney World, and we were staying in this like condominium complex thing. And every day I would walk down to the gym to work out. And the Sunday that we were there, I'm walking to the gym. And all of a sudden, I look up in front of me, and there's two guys standing in front of me, white shirts, black pants. At first, I thought they might be Mormon because they started coming up to me. That's what I thought they were. But they came up to me, and they were like, hey, do you know anything about Judaism? And I was like, I know a little bit about it. And they're like, we've got a problem we need you to help us with. And so I go inside this condominium with these folks, and the second I walk in there, it's an entire family of Orthodox Jews. I mean, like 20 of them packed into this place. And inside each one of these places that we stayed at, there was a sliding glass door in the back. And in order to make sure, because it's hot, it's Florida, right? In order to make sure that people shut those doors and didn't accidentally leave them open, there was this little button on the wall. And you had to press that button before you went out, or this buzzer, obnoxious buzzer would go off every time. And so when we first got there, we just kept forgetting. I mean, every 5 minutes, we had 10 kids with us that were under the age of 10. It was like, beep, beep, beep. I mean, every 5 seconds. And so we finally learned, you got to push this button first. You could open the door then without it buzzing, and then you shut it within 10 seconds or something like that. So I get in there, and I kid you not, they are trying to figure out how to jerry-rig this button because it's the Sabbath. And they are not allowed to touch this button because it is considered electricity. It's considered work. It's like a light switch. They're not allowed to turn any lights on. It's dark in there. They're not allowed to turn any lights on or off, right? And so what they're asking me to do, it's okay for me to do it though. Hold this button while we try to figure out how to make it stop. So I'm holding this button. They're working on the door. I'm standing there having a conversation with them. Where are you guys from? Yada, yada. They kind of get it to like not, they're trying to like put like tape on it. And like, I don't even know what they were doing. I'm just so blown away by what's happening. So I leave. They get it and they think, all right, it's good. I leave. I'm about to leave the house. Beep. Turn around, walk back, put my finger back on the button. This goes on for 15 minutes. Me going back to and the whole time in my mind, this is what I'm thinking. Guys, you don't have to do this. The Messiah is here. Jesus is here. Let me introduce you to him. Like this is insanity, right? This day that is supposed to be a restful day, and I just want you to see the modern, like practical application of this. They're living in hell on this day. This is not freeing in any way, shape. This is insanity. They're about to lose their minds because they can't touch a button. It's craziness, right? And so this is what the Pharisees have done with all of these laws and all of these rules that are man-made, that did not come from God. They have just burdened people to the nth degree, right? And so in the crazy laws of the Pharisees on the Sabbath, right? The disciples, here's what they're doing. They're reaping by picking the grain. They're sifting by removing the husk. They're threshing by rubbing the grain together. They're winnowing. Again, all these things you're not allowed to do on the Sabbath. They're winnowing by throwing it in the air, and they are preparing a meal. That's the one that's the most insane to me. They consider that preparing a meal. This is what the Pharisees are looking at them and saying. And so the bottom line is, it's ridiculous. It is this crushing weight. And Jesus is not having any of it. I think one thing that fascinates me about this story is, right, the disciples, most likely, we don't know where they were walking to or from, but they've probably gone much more than 1,999 paces. But guess who is right there behind them? The Pharisees. They're the biggest hypocrites on the planet. They're right there, probably breaking the law themselves that they are so adamantly telling everybody else you can't. Right? And so Jesus, he's not having any of it. And I love his response. This is so good. Jesus is so smart. He answered, have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar, the high priest, he entered the house of God and he ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for the priests to eat. And he also, not only did he eat himself, he gave some to his companions. And so he asks them a question. He answers their question with a question, right? And what does he do? He points back to the Old Testament, which, by the way, the Pharisees are supposed to be the experts in. They're supposed to know this. They absolutely know. When he says, have you not heard? I mean, I can just feel the condescending and sarcastic tone. As my kids would say, he gave them a 3rd-degree burn. That's what they say to me when somebody burns you. 3rd-degree burn right here from Jesus, right? He's burning them, man, right? Because if you look at this story that happened in the Old Testament, right? Let's understand, again, context. During those days on the Sabbath, what would happen is the high priest or the priest would make 12 loaves of bread. They would put it on this like gold table, and it kind of served as like a sacrifice, and no one was allowed to touch it. No one was allowed to eat it. After 7 days, the priest, and only the priest, was allowed to take that consecrated bread that was consecrated to the Lord, and he could eat it, but nobody else. That was it. That was the law. And so when David shows up, David's on the run from Saul at this point. We'll get a quick little Old Testament lesson here. He's on the run from Saul for his life, hiding out in caves, probably starving half the time, and his men are hungry. And so he shows up here to the priest, and he's like, listen, man, we're hungry. We need some food. Can we please, I know we're not supposed to, but can we eat the consecrated bread? And the guy the priest lets him eat the bread, right? And David and his men, do they get punished for this? They do not. They don't get punished for this. Does the priest get punished for this? No. Why? This is so important and really very much at the heart of what this message is going to be about today. Because the compassion of God always trumps adherence to ritual and ceremony in God's kingdom. Always. Every time. His compassion and his love for people are going to trump ritualistic laws and rules every single time. And so they don't get in trouble for this. Why? Because what does God care most about? That they follow some rule or that they're not starving to death? Or we know that's that God cares about his people. He's not going to let them starve over some silly rule, right? And so this is what Jesus is saying. Who's the real violators of the Sabbath here? Us? Because we're a little bit hungry and we plucked a few heads of grain? Or you guys who have imposed these ridiculous, insane rules, put all this weight and burden on people, and turned the Sabbath day, which is supposed to be a day of rest, into the day that really requires the most work in a lot of ways, because you're working so hard to not do all of these things. You're the violators of the Sabbath. That's what Jesus is saying. And it doesn't say exactly. We're going to find out here in a minute as we continue on. The Pharisees they're getting hot, man. They're getting heated. They are fired up. They're fuming after Jesus says something like that to them. Right? Because they're supposed to be the guys who have it all together. These are the religious guys, right? And so what it really was Jesus is revealing their hearts. He's revealing their hearts. You care more about your laws and your rules than you do about my hungry men. And that's messed up. That is completely opposite to the heart of God. You think you're in the will of God and lined up with the heart of God. You're not. It's the opposite of that, right? I love Matthew 12:7. He gives this same account. And in his account, he says this, Jesus says this, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. If you knew that I desired mercy, not sacrifice, you would not impose these ridiculous rules and laws on these people and burden them down. So he goes on. Then he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Now, we read that now and we think, yeah, okay. What's the big deal? What Jesus is doing here, again, if they weren't already furious, this would have put them over the top, man. Because what he's basically saying is, I am God. I created the Sabbath. And I get to make the rules about what happens on the Sabbath. And here's what you guys need to know. The Sabbath was created for you, to be a good thing for you. What does he say? The Sabbath was made for man, not the other way around, not man for the Sabbath. Jesus is like, I was there in the beginning. Do you not see that? Do you not recognize who I am? In the very beginning, when God spoke the words to create the world, to create the universe, I was there. I get to make the rules, not you. And you have taken it upon yourself to make man-made rules that are crushing people. And I'm not okay with it. Right? He's essentially blowing their minds, man. He is Lord of the Sabbath. He lays claim to being God, right? And what he's doing is he's trying to call them back to the original purpose and plan for the Sabbath. Right? When God rested on the seventh day, he was establishing, see, I'm one of those people who believes the Sabbath was instituted in the very first 7 days of creation. Was it given in the law of Moses more specifically? Yes. But there's no doubt about it. When you look, we just studied Genesis earlier this year, right? God put this rhythm of rest in place for our own good and our own benefit. Jesus is trying to get them to see that, call them back to that. Stop with all this nonsense. This is crazy, right? And really, he's revealing and exposing their hypocrisy. Because nobody is capable of keeping all those laws perfectly. Nobody. Not them, not anybody. Right? And so he goes on. Later, Mark continues on, and he's going to show us even further, even deeper, how sick the Pharisees' hearts really are. Because this is one thing. It's one thing to be like, hey, you need to follow all the rules. You shouldn't be harvesting on the Sabbath. You can wait till wherever you're going to get to, and the meal that's prepared there that's already been prepared the day before, and you can eat that. Okay, all right, that's one thing. But what happens next, man, this is truly messed up. It says, another time Jesus went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath. Luke 6:6 in his account actually tells us Jesus was teaching there. He's in the synagogue, he's teaching. So he's most likely drawn a pretty big crowd. By this point, everywhere Jesus goes, everywhere he teaches, the crowds are flocking. They want to hear Jesus. They want to maybe see him do some kind of a miracle. It says that a man was there with a shriveled hand. The word that's used there, the Greek word that's used there is zeraino. And what it means is atrophy. So when you think of a hand that just is kind of shriveled and decrepit and unable to be used, it was not functional in any way, shape, or form. And so I want you to imagine, think about how much we need our hands now to get work done. It was 10 times more needed in those days. Right, nowadays, we have computers that can do things for us. We can talk into our phones to text or type something, right? Your hands were critical. If it's his dominant hand, it would have rendered this guy most likely unable to work. And so not only does he have this deformity, not only is his life much more difficult just on a practical level, most likely he can't make any money. He may be homeless. His whole life is wrecked. And so Jesus sees this man in the crowd. And he calls him out. The Pharisees, we know, are watching every move Jesus makes. I mean, they are just looking for a way to catch him, trap him in some sort of teaching or healing that they can put him on trial and put him to death. They're already working towards that, right? And so Jesus knows this. He knows exactly what the Pharisees are about. He could wait, right? He could wait and just be like, okay, I'll just heal this guy tomorrow. But again, I love Jesus so much. Jesus loves to just stir the pot, man. He's like, no, we're gonna cause a scene right now. And that's what he does. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, stand up in front of everyone. So he calls this guy out. Now, if I'm that guy, I've got to be honest. I'm like, I want to be healed, but I don't know, man. Like, the Pharisees are here. They're going to be angry with me. Jesus shouldn't be doing this, right? Then Jesus asks them. So he does. He stands up. Jesus asks them, which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill? It says, but they remained silent. They remained silent. And so this stunned man steps up, right? And Jesus asks them this question: which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill? According to Matthew's account, this is what happened in Matthew 12, 10 through 12. It says, and a man with a shriveled hand was there, looking for a reason to bring charges against Jesus. They asked him, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? So Matthew tells us they ask him a question first before he responds with this. He said to them, if any of you has a sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a person than a sheep? Therefore, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Now, again, this is the craziness of the Pharisees' rules, and in many ways reveals their heart and their greed. It was okay if one of your sheep that would lose you money fell into a pit and you pulled that out on the Sabbath. But to heal somebody on the Sabbath was not okay. Now, I don't know about you, but man, that's beyond messed up. And Jesus is calling them out for that. He's like, you guys are the biggest hypocrites on the face of the planet. Which is lawful, to do good or to do evil on the Sabbath? And Jesus' question, again, it's so smart. It's a question they can't get out of. And so it tells us what happens. They're silent. They don't give an answer, right? They can't get out of this question. It's third degree burn number 2 here for today, right? You say you're good, but you intentionally harm. That's what they're doing, right? You say you're all about God. You say you're all about following his laws, but you intentionally want to harm this man today by not allowing him to be healed, right? They'd rather do harm to Jesus. This is crazy. They'd rather do harm to him and catch him doing something he's not supposed to do than let this man be healed. That's the epitome of evil, right? So what they want here is they want Jesus to violate the rules, which, think about the insanity of that. They're adamant we shouldn't break the rules, but they want Jesus to break it. That's twisted and messed up, right? And so here's what's happening. If they say it's okay to do good, right, and to heal this guy on the Sabbath, guess what? Well, now we can't trap Jesus anymore. We can't trap him. And that's exactly what they want. They want to trap him in the worst way. They want something to indict him on. But if they say, yeah, don't do good on the Sabbath, I mean, I don't know about you, but that makes me look pretty bad if I say that. I'm standing there, here's this guy, Jesus wants to heal, and I'm like, so they're stuck. No matter what they say, they're not getting what they want. They're either going to look really bad or Jesus is going to look really good. And they don't want either of those things, right? And so it forced them really to kind of wrestle with this question. Who's really honoring God here in this situation, in this moment? It's not them, that's for sure. It's not them in any way, right? The one who shows mercy is the one who's honoring God, not the one who ignores the suffering of somebody else. And so they say nothing. And at this, Jesus, I'm sure Jesus was like a little bit righteously angry already. But at this, when they just stand there with their mouths closed and say nothing, this is what it says. He looked around at them in anger and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out and his hand was completely restored. And I just imagine, again, let's put our imagination caps on. We're standing in the synagogue. There's this big crowd, man standing right in front of Jesus. The Pharisees are all watching. And Jesus is just like, "You people, the evil in your hearts, the hardness of your hearts, the lack of love in your hearts makes me sick." And he says he is distressed by it. He's distressed by their stubborn hearts. He's angry at the hardness of their hearts. And I believe this because Jesus is so compassionate, even for these Pharisees. I believe he's just as distressed at the eternal destruction that they are headed towards. Because I don't think he wants them to be like that. He wants them to get it. He wants them to realize this is what I'm really all about, not what you guys have made this all about. He's trying to show them what he's really about, and they just will not get it. And so he restores this man's hand. The guy's hand probably just, miraculously like, boom, healed. He gets to go back to, a normal life. And at this, at that point, if I'm the Pharisees, I'm like, man, look what he just did. He's got the power to do that. Maybe there's something to this guy. Maybe I should start listening to the teachings. Maybe I should soften my heart a little bit. And that's not what happens. Mark 3, verse 6. Then the Pharisees went out and they began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. Again, Luke's account, Luke 6:11 tells us they're fuming. They are they're in a rage, right? Why? Because he's just showed them up in front of everybody. And he is threatening their whole way of life, and he's threatening to take away everything that they've built for themselves. Right? And so what do? This is a small detail, but I think it's a powerful one. Who do they go to collaborate with in order to take Jesus down? It says it's this group of people called the Herodians, which were essentially a group of people who followed the Herods. Right? That name Herod shows up all over the place in the New Testament. Right? Herod the Great was the Herod that tried to kill all of the baby boys when Jesus was first born. There's a guy by the name of Herod Antipas. We've talked about him in the past, right? So these Herodians are essentially loyal to Rome. They're in power in Israel, but they're loyal to Rome. And so you've got two groups of people here who really don't like Jesus because Jesus is a threat to both of their powers. Right? They don't want, Jesus going around telling people this is the new king. Well, if he's the king, then the Herods can't be king in Israel anymore. Right? So they want to get rid of him. The Pharisees don't like him. They want to get rid of him. We know that, right? And so what do? They come together against this common enemy and they begin to plan and plot the destruction of Jesus. And so when I say that a storm was beginning to brew, it was. Like people were ready to take him down. And as we kind of close out this series, it's going to be the last week for a while. We're going to come back season 2 sometime maybe later this year. But I want us to be kind of left with that thought in our minds. Right? Jesus has done so much good in such a very short amount of time. It's just amazing teaching. Sharing with people what this new kingdom is really going to be about, what the gospel is going to be about. There are those who get it very early, the early adopters, and there are those whose hearts just stay hardened to it. And ultimately, as I said before, what's going to happen is Jesus is going to end up on the cross. And so, in both cases, I want to make this practical for us today. In both cases, here's the problem for the Pharisees. And I think it's a great reminder for us today. They have zero concern for the well-being of the people that they are so vehemently trying to force into their rules and regulations. No concern whatsoever. You have the disciples on the one hand, first of all, who are hungry. And they could not care less if they're hungry. I don't care if you're hungry. You need to follow the rules, right? Then you have this man with the shriveled hand, this deformed hand, and they could not care less that this man's whole life has probably been ruined because his hand doesn't work properly. No compassion, no love. All they care about is their rules. And this is the message today. When superficial rules become more important than loving others, we have completely missed the heart of Jesus. And this can play out. You know, we think, oh, I'm not like the Pharisees. I've been thinking about this week in my own life. How often do my needs, my wants, my desires, the way that I want to do things, my rules, the way I want my children to live in my house, how often does that trump the love that I have for people? And I think it's way more often than I'd like to admit, unfortunately. But I want to help us maybe be set free a little bit this morning. Because maybe you came in here today and you've just thought Christianity was all about the rules. I got to follow all the rules. If I don't follow the rules, I'm not a good Christian. If I'm not a good Christian, then God won't love me, and then I'm going to be kept out of heaven. And so I got to follow the rules, got to follow the rules, got to follow the rules. Right? And the Pharisees, right, that's their motto. Like, we got to follow all the rules. But the Pharisees followed the rules they liked, let's be honest. They broke lots of rules. They didn't follow all these rules perfectly, right? And they ignored the ones that they didn't, right? They found ways around all of these laws that they put in place because they were in power and they were in charge, so they could do what they wanted. And nobody could call them out or say anything about them. But here's the truth. Jesus makes this very simple for us. He comes and he completely changes the game. He makes it very simple for us in practicality, or I mean in what's the word I'm looking for? Like in the way we think about it, in our hearts, but much more difficult actually in practicality. Much more difficult to live this out. Because let me ask you a question. What's easier? To follow a bunch of kind of just like standard basic rules, okay, I got to brush my teeth. I got to, take a shower every day, hopefully. Most of you are doing that. Right? Like we have rules that we kind of live by every day. Right? Those things are pretty easy. But when it comes to loving my wife the way that Christ loved me, loving my children that way, loving other people that way, loving my neighbor who's super annoying, and I don't really even like them, which is more difficult? And see, what the Pharisees have done is they want to be able to say, yes, I'm good with God because these rules that I've set up and established, these are actually easy to follow. But the most difficult rule, and we're going to read this here in a second, the one rule, the one law that Jesus actually gives us that we have to follow, that he calls us to follow, is so much more difficult to follow. Let's read this. Jesus would challenge them with this in Matthew chapter 22. He challenges them in Mark 12, much later in Mark. This is what Jesus said. The Pharisees come to him and they ask him, what is the number one most important law, Jesus? In other words, what's the most important rule that we have to follow? And this is what Jesus says. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. all of the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. In other words, here's what Jesus is saying. There is one rule to rule them all. You Lord of the Rings fans, that kind of has a ring to it, right? One ring to rule them all. There's one rule to rule them all. What does it say? All of the law and the prophets hang on these two things, which are intimately tied together. If you are going to love God, the outflow of that in our lives is loving people. That's actually how we love God. That's the number one way we love God, is by loving people. This is the only rule, he's saying. This is the only law. Why? Does it mean that all of the 10 commandments no longer are important? No, because what does he say? He says all the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. So every law that God has ever put in place, it is hinged, it's attached, it's hung off of this one command: to love God and to love people. Which is, come on, we all know this. Let's just do a heart check right now. Infinitely more difficult than following a whole bunch of man-made laws. I mean, it's just so much harder. And every day, I'm going to be honest with you, I feel like I'm failing at that. It is so unbelievably difficult. And so this was a revelation that I had this week. And I'm so thankful for this. This one law, when you really start to think about how difficult it is, it can do one of two things. It can make you feel like, I'll never be able to do that. I'll never be able to love people the way Jesus loved people. With that kind of compassion, with that kind of selflessness. I mean, the selflessness that it requires to really love people. Or it can drive us to the gospel. It can drive us to the gospel of Jesus Christ that says, listen, yes, this is my one command. This is my one rule to rule them all. And I want you to strive for that. But if you fail at it and you mess up at it, I got good news for you today. I went to the cross, paid the penalty for your sin, even though you'll never completely, fully be able to live that out to perfection, so that you could be free from the burden, the constant burden of feeling like you're a failure. And this week, I've had one of those weeks where, man, I have felt like a failure big time. I'm just gonna be transparent with you today. I felt like a failure in my marriage. I have felt like a failure as a father. I have felt like a failure as a pastor, because I don't feel like I have lived up to that standard, to really love people the way that Jesus loved them. But what it's done this week, and what it's even done just to me this morning before I even got up here to preach this message, is it's driven me to the cross, where there is endless mercy and grace. And what God is doing in me, and what I want him to do in you, is to free you from the burden of any type of legalistic living, and to begin to just love the way that Christ loved. Because that's what's going to change the world. It's not all our rules and all of our regulations. It's how we love the people around us. Or there's an old song, I was thinking about it this week. They will know we are Christians by our love. Right? Have you heard that song? If you grew up in church, you've heard that. They will know we are Christians by our love. John 13:34, a new command I give you, love one another as I have loved you. By this, all men will know that you are my disciples. Not by how many times we go to church every month, not by how many times we read our Bible every week, not by how many minutes we spend in prayer. They will know by our love. And I believe there is a hurting world. There is a world full of people with crippled hands, metaphorically speaking, who desperately need the church to show them the love of Jesus Christ, what that really looks like. And that doesn't mean we're going to start a new series in a couple of weeks. We're going to actually talk about our core values here. Two of our biggest core values are show grace and speak truth. Being loving to the world around us does not mean holding back the truth. Never, because the truth will set you free. Jesus never held back the truth. But there was this incredible love and compassion that he had for people. And I worry sometimes for myself, and I worry sometimes for the church, and even for our church. Are we actually taking that seriously? And this is my challenge to you, and with this we'll be done today. If we walked out of here and we just began to ask this question in every interaction we have with people, what does love require of me in this situation? What does love require of me in this moment, in this interaction I'm having with my wife, with my kids, with my coworker, with my neighbor, whoever it might be? What does love require of me in this moment? Two things will begin to happen. Your heart will just get so aligned with your Heavenly Father. You know, the whole point, I believe, of becoming a follower of Jesus is to become more like him. Right? As we begin to ask that question, we actually begin to live that out. It changes us. And then as we are changed and people begin to see that as we interact with people in our world, I believe they will begin to change. As they see that there is something different about these Christian people. And the thing that makes them different is not all of the ritualistic things they do, but the love that they have. It's just different from the rest of the world. And church, that's what I want us to be. True North Church, that's what I want us to be when we walk out of here today. Putting that as the highest priority, right? Jesus tells us this is the greatest command, the one rule to rule them all. Let's just live by that one and let the rest take care of itself.